On a cross-country flight, Daniel approached Mrs. Peterson, an elderly veteran seated comfortably by the window. Without hesitation, he demanded, "I need you to move that seat is mine." The tone in his voice was authoritative, clearly expecting little resistance. The other passengers nearby couldn't help but notice the audacity in his request, especially given Mrs. Peterson's frail yet dignified presence. Daniel's patience was visibly thin. "I need that seat more than you do," he insisted rudely, crossing his arms and tapping his foot. His irritation was clear, as if his needs were more important. But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Every word dripped with a sense of superiority that contrasted sharply with Mrs. Peterson's quiet dignity. As the confrontation escalated, more passengers began to notice. Eyes widened and whispers spread through the cabin. Several passengers began to murmur, expressing their disapproval of Daniel's behavior. The collective sentiment was clear: Daniel's actions were out of line, and many felt a strong sense of indignation on Mrs. Peterson's behalf. Despite the growing discontent, Daniel remained unapologetic. He settled into the seat, clearly still convinced that he deserved it. Throughout the flight, he acted entitled, stretching his legs and leaning back without a care. The passengers seated next to Mrs. Peterson expressed their deep admiration for veterans. "My father served in the army," they said, "so I have a lot of respect for what you've done." They offered Mrs. Peterson moral support, appreciating her stories and dedication. This shared respect for her service bridged the gap between them, creating an instant bond. Daniel couldn't help but overhear Mrs. Peterson's conversation with her new seatmate. He rolled his eyes and muttered something under his breath, clearly uninterested in the veteran's stories. By now, most passengers were aware of his rude behavior, and his continuous and ambiguous indifference seemed to further cement everyone's sour opinion of him. As Mrs. Peterson slowly made her way off the plane, several passengers approached her to express their gratitude. "Thank you for your service," one woman said, extending a hand. Another person nodded appreciatively, their respect evident. These gestures, though small, conveyed a profound sense of admiration and acknowledgement, filling Mrs. Peterson with a renewed sense of pride as she exited the plane with grace. Upon arriving at the airport terminal, Mrs. Peterson was greeted warmly by her granddaughter, Laura. Grandma, how was your flight?" Lauren asked as she hugged Mrs. Peterson. The sight of her familiar face brought immediate comfort. With her granddaughter's help, they collected her luggage and headed toward the parking lot, making their way to the car for the drive home. When they arrived home, Mrs. Peterson was greeted by the familiar surroundings of her cozy living room. Lauren helped her settle in, placing her luggage by the door. Mrs. Peterson then made her way to a chest of drawers where she kept her old military memorabilia. She carefully opened a drawer and began to sift through the items, remembering the years of service that had defined so much of her life. As Mrs. Peterson looked through her old medals, photos, and letters, she found comfort in revisiting memories of her service days. Each item held a special significance, a reminder of the friendships, challenges, and triumphs she had experienced. The tangible evidence of evidence of her contributions brought a sense of solace. The earlier incident began to fade as she immersed herself in these cherished recollections, finding peace in the past. Mrs. Peterson began explaining to airline representatives what had transpired on the flight. She described Daniel's rude demand for her to vacate her seat and his overall dismissive behavior. Expressing her disappointment, she emphasized the need for such actions to be taken seriously to maintain respect for elders and veterans alike. The airline wasted no time in responding to Mrs. Peterson's complaint, but a representative called her to extend a heartfelt apology, stating that they were appalled by the behavior described. They assured her that they would investigate the matter thoroughly and take appropriate action. This acknowledgement brought a modest comfort to Mrs. Peterson, knowing that her voice had been heard at a corporate level. One of the community leaders, a former Marine named Hank, suggested they identify Daniel and inform other veteran communities about his behavior. "We can't let this slide," he said. "People need to know who he is so we can avoid situations like this." The idea of creating a network of awareness resonated with everyone, and Mrs. Peterson felt a surge of determination to see this plan through. Mrs. Peterson decided to go along with Hank's idea and put her efforts into action. She gathered the group to brainstorm on how to best identify Daniel and ensure the message reached other veterans. They discussed various strategies, including gathering testimonies from fellow passengers and utilizing social media to spread the word. With the testimonies in hand, Mrs. Peterson began piecing together more information about Daniel. She created a detailed timeline of events based on the varied accounts she had received. As Mrs. Peterson delved deeper into gathering information, she discovered that Daniel was a frequent traveler. His name popped up in various travel forums and social media platforms. It became clear that he often flaunted his elite status and the perks that came with it. So this revelation added a new dimension to their mission, as they realized that Daniel's behavior wasn't just a one-time incident, but a part of his usual demeanor. The news of Daniel's disrespectful behavior spread quickly within veteran circles. Local organizations posted warnings in their newsletters and social media pages. Messages poured in, not just from local communities but from national veteran networks as well. Mrs. Peterson's story resonated with many, igniting a collective determination to stand against such behavior. Well, veterans in Daniel's area took the matter seriously. They vowed to confront him if he ever showed disrespect to their community again. News about the incident began to ripple through various local news channels. The reporters picked up on the story and started featuring it in their segments. The story soon gained traction, spreading beyond the local area and reaching a wider audience. A journalist named Sarah from a well-known local news station contacted Mrs. Peterson for an interview. Sarah expressed genuine concern about the incident and wanted Mrs. Peterson to share her story on air. The interview aired during prime time and immediately garnered significant attention. People were moved by Mrs. Peterson's composed yet powerful recount of the incident. As viewers watched Mrs. Peterson's interview, many felt a surge of support and solidarity. People took to social media to voice their appreciation for veterans and to critique the disrespect shown by Daniel. In the days following the interview, Mrs. Peterson's story became a hot topic in the media. Talk shows, radio programs, and online blogs picked up the story, each putting their own spin on the significance of respecting veterans. Other veterans also began sharing their experiences, adding depth to the conversation. Soon after the story aired, Daniel began receiving backlash from people who recognized him. Strangers approached him, condemning his behavior. Social media profiles pointing him out emerged, with many expressing their displeasure. His actions were shared and critiqued, making him an object of public scorn. Daniel's friends and colleagues couldn't ignore the news they'd seen and heard. Several of them reached out, voicing their disappointment and disapproval of his actions. Water cooler conversations at work buzzed with talk of Daniel's behavior and its implications. It wasn't just the public that was upset. Those close to him felt embarrassed and let down. The realization of how deeply his actions had hurt others struck a chord, adding to his growing sense of remorse. Daniel felt the increasing pressure to make amends for his actions. The constant backlash, combined with the disappointment from his friends and colleagues, made him reflect on what he had done. Faced with the reality of his behavior, Daniel started to consider ways to make things right and show genuine remorse for his actions. The response to Daniel's public apology was mixed. Some people accepted his apology, recognizing his effort to make things right and believing in second chances. Others remained critical, feeling that his words were not enough to undo the disrespect he had shown. Mrs. Peterson saw Daniel's apology but chose not to respond immediately. Instead, she took her time to carefully consider the sincerity of his words and the motivations behind them. Hence, the veteran community, inspired by Mrs. Peterson's efforts, decided to organize a special event to honor her. They wanted to recognize her not only for her service, but also for her unwavering dedication to promoting respect for veterans. Its invitations were sent out, and the event quickly became a talking point among local veterans and supporters. The community eagerly prepared to celebrate Mrs. Peterson's. At the special event, Mrs. Peterson addressed the gathered audience with a heartfelt speech. She spoke about the incident with Daniel, using it as a teachable moment to emphasize the importance of mutual respect. The shared experiences and mutual respect created a supportive environment. The community left the event feeling more united and determined to continue Mrs. Peterson's mission of promoting respect and appreciation for all veterans. Privately, Mrs. Peterson took time to learn more about Daniel's background. She discovered that he had a history that might have contributed to his actions on the plane. Reflecting on this information, Mrs. Peterson had to decide how to proceed. Balancing justice with compassion, she pondered the best way forward, considering the broader impact it might have. They agreed to meet at the local cafe on a Wednesday afternoon. Mrs. Peterson arrived a few minutes early, feeling a mix of nervousness and determination. She watched as Daniel entered and headed toward her table. He greeted her with a modest smile and a handshake. During their conversation at the cafe, Daniel expressed his deep remorse for his actions on the plane. He admitted that he had acted impulsively and without thought. And Daniel vowed to be more considerate and actively support veteran causes going forward. He promised to volunteer at local veteran organizations and donate to charities that supported former service members. Mrs. Peterson appreciated his commitment and gave him some recommendations on where to start. As their meeting came to an end, Mrs. Peterson saw a genuine change in Daniel's attitude. He appeared more humble and aware of the ways his actions could affect others. The two of them parted ways with a newfound respect for each other. Daniel thanked Mrs. Peterson for her time and promised to keep in touch. They shook hands warmly, and she walked away feeling that a meaningful connection had been made. This encounter reminded both of them of the importance of compassion, understanding, and respect. Mrs. Peterson returned home feeling hopeful about the positive impact of their encounter. She reflected on the conversation and the changes she had witnessed in Daniel. It reassured her that there were still opportunities for people to learn and grow. This experience reinforced her belief in the power of communication and the importance of standing up for oneself. She felt a renewed sense of optimism and purpose.